quite a bit in our neighborhood and don't live that far apart. But the roads have been clear. We're thankful for that. For the most part, I believe it's pretty safe to get out on the roads, and I appreciate all of you coming. And one problem we seem to always have is that here where we're located, our parking lot nearly always has more snow for some reason, and the shade from the wintertime here, it doesn't melt very well. So be careful getting in and out if you're out in the lower parking lot. But welcome this morning. We're glad that you're all able to be here. And I want to begin by reading from Psalm 127, because certainly I believe that one of the greatest responsibilities and privileges that we have in life is bringing up children in the Lord. And looking back on our lives, I think we can all see how that was such an important time in life. And today, I believe our only family would be Jeremy and Jen, who have their children. I was hoping that Jeremy and Julie and Chad and Emily would be here this morning to hear this lesson, but I'm thinking of not only just young families that are raising children, but also all of us in life to recognize the importance of the family and how important it is that parents are raising children in the Lord to be future Christians and believers in God, because there's certainly a spiritual battle that is happening throughout the world today. And so God gives us children and gives us a great responsibility and a blessing there as we raise our children to serve Him. But in Psalm 127, beginning with, I'm going to go ahead and read verse 1 through 5. It's only 5 verses in this psalm, but it talks a lot here about the importance of raising children. So he says that unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so He gives His beloved sleep. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The gift of the womb, the fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate. So in the reading that I have read from the New King James Version, we see that children are a heritage from the Lord. And in some of the translations, it actually says that children are a gift of the Lord. And I like that translation because I believe certainly that children are a gift from the Lord. I want to begin with that thought today to try to emphasize that, how true it is. Children are a gift from God. And as we think about that in our world today, some of the things that are happening, it's so important that we as Christians have that point of view, that we of all people need to see children as a blessing in our lives. We know that that is going to be today different from the perspective many people have. Unfortunately, out in the world, it's come to the point of seeing children as being a burden almost today, or a hindrance, not giving you the freedom to live your life and be all that you want in your life. Children are getting in the way of that in the minds of some people, it seems, today. But the Scriptures, I believe, are very clear when we look into God's Word, and that is that children are a gift from the Lord. And so the psalmist recognized that. He talked here in the beginning of Psalm 127 about the fact that unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. So in any endeavor that we have in life, if God is not in it with us, then it's doomed to fail. The point is that in raising a family and building a household, and you could apply it to building the house you live in, or you could build it to the family that lives in the house. That unless God is involved with us in that endeavor, and we are seeking to His help, then we're not going to succeed in life. And there's nowhere that is more true than when it comes to raising a family, especially raising a family to love and serve God. So valuable and so needed in our world today. So the Bible says that children are a blessing from God. Whenever each of our children has been born, Karen and I have always certainly looked at it that way. When our girls were born, and I can think back to each one of their births very easily and very clearly in my mind, and being able to hold them in our arms for the first time and just see what a gift from God that He has blessed us with. But it's also a responsibility that He has placed in our hands at that point. But such a beautiful, precious life. And we're getting ready to go over this week, the Lord willing, to visit and see our new granddaughter, Sylvie, in Missoula, Montana. And we can't wait to hold her and see her for the first time. But children are a blessing from God and a gift from the Lord. Now, there is an account that I think is very interesting in the Old Testament where David was in the process bringing the Ark of the Covenant up to Jerusalem. And the first time that he attempted to do this, the Ark was unsteady on the cart and began to topple off, and Uzzah reached out and touched it. Most of us are familiar with that account where Uzzah died, and they had to go back and look and see what had gone wrong and realize that God had clearly said not to touch the ark, that was to be carried very carefully by the Levites, and they had not followed that instruction. That's why this man died, and it was a tragic thing. But then they went back and they began to bring the ark up, and they were successful. But during that time when the ark was being kept there, it was stored at the house of a man named Obed-Edom. And during that time, Obed-Edom made sure that the ark was safe at his house. And because of that, God blessed his household. There's statements that are made about this in 1 Chronicles chapter 13, that it said, because Obed-Edom had the ark there in his house, the Lord blessed the family of Obed-Edom. Now, you don't find out exactly how this was done until a little bit later in chapter 26 of 1 Chronicles 26, and verses 4 and 5 there. But it says that he had sons, and it goes on to name these sons. He actually had 8 sons. And so one of the ways that God blessed the family and the house of Obed-Edom was He blessed him with 8 sons that became part of his heritage and his family. So those were a blessing to the home of Obed-Edom. And today, whenever children are born, they are a blessing to us. In fact, the psalmist here, he says, blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them, and indicating a blessing to have a large family. And that's another thing that today is being sort of frowned on, that we have this feeling of overpopulation of the earth and too many people. So there is almost a looking down upon having children by people around us. And that idea has infected the minds of the general population in some way. But David, in the Bible, I believe, recognized that they were a blessing from God. He talks about that. And also, the Bible said that having children was a sign of God's providence and His hand of the continuing to be with man, to bless man. Because you recall that in the book of Genesis, when man sinned, Adam and Eve, in the Garden of Eden, there was a curse that was pronounced by God. And yet, following that, in Genesis chapter 4, we read that Adam and Eve, Adam had relations with his wife. He knew his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. So she gave birth, and this was the first time that a woman gave childbirth in this way. It was with pain. That was one of the consequences that was indicated when sin occurred, that she would have pain with childbirth. But it was a blessing when she had her son, and she recognized that God had helped her in order to have this child that she now was blessed with. And since that time, women have continued to give birth to children. And the Bible always looks at that as being a blessing. Even though there is pain that is involved in the birth of a child each time, nevertheless, it is a blessing to the mothers and it is a blessing to the fathers when we have our children that can be born and become part of our families. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, the Apostle Paul in verse 15, he talks about the fact that women will be preserved through the bearing of children. And as he talks about the roles that men and women have, that goes back to the creation, and that women are not to preach or be in a position of leadership. It speaks about that they are to be in submission, and the men are to be the ones who are in leadership. But it speaks about the fact that this does not mean that spiritually women are inferior. Women have an important role, and through motherhood and through being a wife and mother, it says that women will be saved or preserved through the bearing of children. And that indicates, I believe, that God looks upon mothers as what they are fulfilling as being a mother and a wife and bearing children and preserving the family, that there's a special blessing that God has, that women are valuable, is what the Apostle Paul is bringing out. So it shouldn't mean that women look at that because of they are not in a leadership role, such as being an elder or a preacher, that they are inferior. They're not. Women are not inferior in any way because of that. Because look, they are given the privilege of bearing children. And whenever we see children, they look to their mother. They have that special love and affection for her. God has made sure that women are not undervalued, because He speaks so highly of the importance of this in His Word. So even though we understand that children are a gift from God, we also need to keep in mind that not every woman is, or not every couple, not every husband and wife is able to have children. And that sometimes is because of no fault on the part of those individuals. It is just something that happens in many cases. So we need to always keep that in mind. Realize that because a person isn't able, or a husband and wife's not able to have children, or has not yet had children, that does not mean that we should look down upon them in any way. In the Bible, it talks about Jacob married Rachel and Leah, for example, in the book of Genesis. And Leah had many children, almost from the beginning of their marriage. She was very lively and fertile, as far as she had child after child, son after son. And Rachel was not able to have any children. And this went on for several years. The Bible speaks about this, that it says in Genesis chapter 30 and verse 1 and 2, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she became jealous of her sister, and she said to Jacob, "Give me children, or else I die." Then Jacob's anger burned against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" So it actually led to, she was bitter, she was jealous about this, that she could not have any children. And yet, it wasn't any fault of hers. It was not her fault, nor was it Jacob's fault. She simply hadn't been blessed with children, at least to that point. Later on, Rachel was able to give birth to two sons, to Joseph and Benjamin, but they came later in her marriage. So there was many years there that went by, and she was just beside herself, that she was not able to keep up with Leah. Sort of a competition, or a feeling that she was not doing her role as she should have been, she felt, and yet it wasn't her fault, anything that she could control. Well, there's an important lesson, I think, that to be learned from that, and that is that those who are childless need to have patience and be willing to be content with things as they are, as God gives those blessings, that it is in the mind of God. It is in the hand of God when that happens, and to be content with what we have at the present time. But certainly we should not look down upon people. We need to have compassion and respect for a couple who had been able to have children. We think of Hannah in the Old Testament, in the book of 1 Samuel. There was the same situation happening there with Hannah. She was not able to have children. She had not been able to have any children. And the other wife of her husband, they were two wives married to the same husband, as happens sometimes there in the Old Testament. But the other woman was mocking her. Her name was Peninnah. And it seemed like every year when they went up to worship God, the Bible talks about the fact that Peninnah would mock Hannah that God had not given her any children. And yet here she had a number of children. So she saw this as, God is blessing me, He's not blessing you. And he made her feel so bad. She made her feel that this was her fault in some way, and that she was not being blessed by God. So Hannah went to God and she prayed for a son, and God gave her a son. God opened her womb, it says, and He blessed her with the birth of Samuel. And Samuel, of course, went on to become the deliverer of Israel. And I think this is why that account is at the beginning of the book of 1 Samuel the way it is that this child that she had went on to be the deliverer of the nation of Israel. That was how important this child was. And yet, he came through special prayer and through special circumstances that God blessed Hannah, and she turned around and gave praise to God as a result of that. So it's important to remember that children are a blessing, but no one is guaranteed that we are going to all have this blessing in life. Some are not able to. Therefore, we recognize children as a gift that God describes them to be. Now, the next thing that I want to have you think about this morning is the contrast, though, with that attitude to what we sometimes are seeing today in our world. That there is this feeling that children are an imposition almost on people's lives. And that they think of children as a burden. So certainly there are important responsibilities that comes with being a parent. And because of that, there are responsibilities that we can see as sacrifices that we have to make. Because of the joy that is going to come from our children, we as parents make sacrifices for our children. And we're willing to do that. That comes with parenthood. Whenever we become parents, we begin to realize, I need to be more mature, I need to grow up, and now I have these lives of these little babies that I am now able to be responsible for them. So I'm going to make sacrifices. I'm going to give up of myself and my own time in order, and it's going to cost us. We're going to put forth a lot of expense, but it's going to be worth it because the joy that is going to come from our family is going to outweigh all of those sacrifices that we make. So I believe that is an attitude that as parents should be understood, that there are sacrifices involved in being a parent, and yet they are all the way worth it to have those children and to be able to see the blessings that comes from our families. And we see an example of this in Jesus himself, I believe, when we think about the sacrifice that Jesus made when he went to the cross on our behalf. The Bible says in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2 that we need to be fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Saying that Jesus, for the joy set before him, endured the cross. You think of the sacrifice that Jesus made when he gave up his life. And yet there was a joy that he saw in that. And what was that joy? It was the saving of souls that would come forth from this. It says in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 10 that in bringing many sons to glory, he became flesh and blood. He took upon our flesh and blood, and he suffered in doing that. He made tremendous sacrifice, but in bringing many sons to glory, he could see the joy of that, and he was willing to make that sacrifice in order to accomplish that. So in the same way, parents today need to look ahead and see the joys that are going to come, and because of that, be willing to sacrifice in order to raise children and put them ahead of our own needs and our own welfare. But there are too many people today that only focus on the burden of having children. And the Bible has examples of this also in the Old Testament, where people actually did not see their children as a blessing from God, and the opportunity they had to raise up this child to love and serve God. No, the children had to take a back seat to their own needs and their own enjoyment of their lives. They were willing to sacrifice their children for themselves instead. And there are people today, sadly, that are doing that same thing, making that same mistake, I believe. But the Bible says in Romans chapter 1 and verse 31 that there are parents who do not have natural affection. This was a mark of the Gentiles. Some of the people of the Gentiles that are spoken of in Romans chapter 1, they had abandoned God. They had turned away from God. And the result of that was an ongoing decline of the morals, of the lifestyles that they lived, and they corrupted themselves and went from one thing to another. It says God gave them up to a debased mind to do those things that are not fitting. But lists out a number of these aspects and characteristics at the end of chapter 1. And it says they did not have natural affection. Well, I believe we're seeing that today happening in our own society, that many times people do not have natural affection for their own children when they have been blessed to be able to look forward to having a child. But there are examples in the Old Testament where some of the Israelites offered their own children in sacrifices to their gods. It speaks of Jeremiah chapter 32 and verse 35, that they built the high places of Baal that are in the valley of Ben Hinnom to cause their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire to Molech, which I had not commanded them, nor had it entered my mind that they should do this abomination to cause Judah to sin. There were people there in the times of Jeremiah then that thought that in order to worship this god Molech, they would offer their own children as a sacrifice. God said, I did not want that. I did not desire that. I did not ask for that in any way. It's an abomination. And yet there were people who had such a low view of the value of their own children that they would sacrifice them in that way. There was also a time in 2 Kings chapter 6 and verse 28 where the city of Samaria was under attack by the Syrians. Syrian armies come in and surrounded the city, and the people were starving. They were having a famine, and it talks about these two women there. It said the king saw these two women in mourning, and he said, what is the matter with you? And she said, this woman said to me, give your son that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. So we boiled my son and ate him, and I said to her the next day, now give your son that we may eat him, but she has hidden her son. Can you imagine that there were people there that were so desperate that they were practicing cannibalism of their own children happening? And I realize that that's an extreme example that the Bible gives of, I can't imagine anything more horrible than that. But it really emphasizes that there is a point at which people see children as not important, and their own welfare is more important, so they are willing to sacrifice their children and not make the sacrifices for them that parents ought to make. Who is it that should make the sacrifices? It should be the parents for the children, and looking to the joy that it's going to bring. Even though we make tremendous sacrifices, it's going to be worthwhile. And yet there are people today, I believe, that only look at that from the standpoint, children are a burden. They get in the way of our own enjoyment. And we do not have that mentality and that attitude that we ought to have when it comes to seeing our children as a blessing from God, as they really are. Those people of Israel were worshiping idol gods. That was another part of the problem there, the idolatry of that day. And yet, when we turn to the New Testament in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5, it says there that idolatry, covetousness, is idolatry. Anything that we put in place of God in our lives is idolatry, becomes an idol. And that can be true of a career or a desired lifestyle that we might have. It might be money, it might be pleasure, it might be many different things. But when we put something up as being more important than God to us, then it becomes an idol. And I believe that's one of the problems in our culture today, is that people do not have God in the place He deserves to be in our life, to love and serve Him with all of our hearts. And as a result of that, people put themselves in the most important place, and it's all about my happiness and my pleasure of my life, and I don't have time for children. Children are going to be an inconvenience to me. It's too much of a burden. So people do not see children as a blessing from God as they need to be. I believe it's a consequence also of the teaching of evolution that has been taught through our society now for many years. The Bible teaches that we are made in the image of God. Genesis chapter 1, 26 and 27. And because of that, human life is sacred. This is the problem we see in abortion today and in many other examples where people do not recognize that human life is above animal life. I believe there are people today that aren't even understanding that human beings, we have a soul that God has blessed us with. And that makes us different than the animals. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 19 through 21, it says, "For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there is no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place, all come from the dust, and to the dust we return. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward, and the breath of the beast descends downward to the earth?" In other words, he's saying that man and animals are the same in that we all die. Death comes to man, death comes to animals. But who knows that the breath of man ascends upward and the breath of the beast descends downward to the earth? He later talks about the fact that when we die, human beings, the spirit returns to God who gave it, and the body returns to the earth. So the animals, all they have is the body, the human, the physical life. And when that goes out, the animal does not have a soul to go to God like man has. Man has a life after death. Animals do not. The Bible is very clear about this, but the evolutionist today believes that humans are no different from animals. And if that's true, if man doesn't have a soul, then a child is expendable. A child is unimportant. And that's certainly contrary to what the Scriptures teach. Think about our day and time. How many millions of babies have been aborted now? And that is one of the greatest plagues upon the modern world, is the continuing of the practice of abortion. Tens of millions of babies have been killed in the womb. And why have they been aborted? In the great majority of cases, it's because either the financial burden seemed to be too much, we can't afford to have a child, or they didn't want to accept the responsibility of raising a child. So often abortions were performed to save the young mother from the embarrassment or the responsibility of an out-of-wedlock birth. But whatever the excuse is given, it shows that people today do not recognize the importance that children are a gift. One of the greatest gifts that we have in life is to be able to have children and raise them up to serve God. Abortion doesn't just terminate a clump of cells. It's a life that has been made in the image of God. And whenever we look at the Bible in Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 4 and 5, Jeremiah said that the Lord came to me and he said, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. And I have appointed you to be a prophet to the nations." David said in Psalm 139 in verse 13 through 16, he said, "For you formed my inward parts, you wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book they were written all the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was none of them." David recognized there and speaks so clearly about life in the womb before birth happens, a precious life there that is in the womb of the mother. Now, as we think about children, though, how are we to treat them as a gift? How do we show our valuing of our children? And first of all is we thank God for them. Just as Hannah did. I mentioned Hannah there in the book of 1 Samuel. And when Hannah did have a child from God, when her son was born, she immediately went to God and gave him praise. 1 Samuel 2, we read about her beautiful prayer that she prayed, thanking God for this child. And of course, she went on to dedicate him to the Lord, as she had vowed before God she would do. If God would give her this son, she would dedicate him to the Lord. And she kept that promise and brought him back to serve God for all of the days of his life. But she gave God the praise and thanked him. And we need to give God the praise when we have children. Be thankful for them. The Bible says to be thankful in all things in life. 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 18. And the blessing of our children, certainly we need to be giving God the thanks when our children and our grandchildren are born. Truly a blessing from God. Second, we need to value them and see them that they are precious in the eyes of God. Now, in the Old Testament, the people of Israel sometimes wandered away from God, and God brought discipline and judgment and punishment upon his own people. In the book of Hosea, the northern kingdom of Israel was unfaithful, and God, through the prophet Hosea, announced some of the punishments that would come. But in Hosea 9 and verse 16, he talked about Ephraim, another name for Israel. Ephraim is stricken, their root is dried up, they will bear no fruit. Even though they bear children, I will slay the precious ones of their womb. Now he's just bringing out how severe this punishment was going to be. When God brought the other nations down to bring judgment, the Assyrians, they would kill the children as well as the adults. They would show no mercy. It was going to be that severe of an attack by them. But even in that, they recognized that their children were their precious ones. And even that, I believe, is a beautiful statement. When he says, I will slay the precious ones of their womb. And lastly, we need to deal with our children, obviously, as the appropriate way that God teaches us to. They're a blessing. We're stewards. We're given a stewardship of our children. And they belong to God, but he entrusts them to us. And in First, in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, speaking to the fathers, he said, "Do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." Now, there's a lot more that can be said about that, but it's so important that as parents, we see that our children is a stewardship that God has given us, and we do have a responsibility to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And that involves discipline, but it also involves instruction and a lot of love on our part and patience as we see our children growing and developing and expressing their personalities. Each one is unique and each one is different. But the important thing is that we as Christians should be distinct from the world around us. In Romans 12 and verse 2, he says, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And we need to recognize that our children are a gift from God. And even though there's going to be responsibilities and sacrifices and hardships that are going to come in raising each one of our children, tremendous sacrifices that we are going to make, we need to still see them. They are a blessing. They're not a burden. They're not an inconvenience. They're worth every bit of that sacrifice that we put in to raise each and every one of our children, to bring them up to love God and serve Him when they reach that age to make the decision to commit their life to God. All of that sacrifice that we have made is going to be worth every bit of it when we look and see the fine young people that they have grown up to be. Well, thank you for your attention this morning, and I encourage us all to, even though we may have raised our own children and we have grandchildren now at this point, to always be ready to speak up and encourage younger women to have that view of the importance, and young couples, how important it is to at least see it as a blessing from God to be able to have children, whether or not we are able to have that in our own lives or not. See it as a blessing from God. We're going to stand and sing the invitation song now. Matt will lead us as we sing number 1, "Have Thine Own Way, Lord."